2 weeks ago, the world was shocked to discover that eLeague had taken the decision, according to their rules, to remove SK Gaming and Luminosity's teams from the latter stages of eLeague, where SK Gaming's Danish lineup was in the last chance qualifier and the Luminosity guys were in the playoffs. Now, at the outset of this video, one of the reasons actually why I've chosen to wear this eLeague t-shirt, I'm also wearing an ESL hoodie, that's irrelevant actually, is because I have to state at the beginning, I am working for eLeague as an analyst for the league, in a similar role I play for other leagues. But I am not in this video representing eLeague in any capacity. By the way, I can't make these videos without doing that. I do it like every minute, so it's just the way it's going to have to be, I'm afraid. I'm not representing eLeague in any capacity. I'm not speaking on eLeague's behalf. I'm not using any information I garnered from eLeague behind the scenes. I'm going to address this exactly as I address all other topics on my channel, as an independent commentator on the scene, observing things, giving my thoughts on what I think of the way they've played out, trying to make sense of certain things that I find illogical, or explain things in a way as I see them that I've noticed there's a gap in the public perception on them. So with that said, this move of eLeague to remove these two teams, it was first announced on their website as, due to roster changes that do not comply with eLeague rules, we regret to announce that Luminosity and SK Gaming are no longer eligible to compete in the remainder of Season 1. And then they go on to explain the teams that will replace them. So for example, Cloud9 replaced Luminosity in the playoff bracket, and then because SK and Cloud9 now no longer were in the last chance qualifier, because Cloud9 finished second in their group, that meant that instead you had to have Gambit and Renegades come in to replace those teams in the last chance qualifier, because they were the next highest ranking teams according to the rule set of how you got into the last chance qualifier. So I went and I looked in the rule book for the rules that covered this particular issue, because notice they said due to roster changes. They didn't say due to teams moving orgs, because essentially this is treated as roster moves between the orgs. And so essentially, the way this is treated is as if the guys from Luminosity removed all their roster, so they don't have a team, they drop out the playoffs. And the guys from SK removed their 5-man roster, but then tried to add 5 people to the roster. And since, as you'll see in the rules, you can't add 5 people in this particular manner, they weren't eligible to continue on in the competition. Now, obviously, there is a chance in theory, since I'm looking at these rules now, they could have been changed and updated on the website. Now, as far as I know, that's not the case. And I haven't seen a single person claim that that in fact is what happened. So in the rule book, which you can find on the eLeague website, on page, well, not on page, on the section 4.3, there are 3 points. So there's point 14 that says all teams must submit their 5-man roster, including 2 subs, by May 18th, 5 p.m. EST, and to a specific person. They say the email there. So by May 18th, you have to have not only declared your 5-man roster, but then the 2 subs that you might have. It then says, point 15, teams will be allowed to use a sub to replace another player twice per season, but replacements must be declared before plane tickets are issued. So again, it's a certain time period you have to declare the subs by. Point 16, team rosters must be complete before plane tickets are issued. If a team decides to change the roster after travel arrangements have been issued, any additional costs must be covered by the respective team. So essentially, in a way, you can make 2 roster changes. And we know there have been teams, in theory, who made roster changes. I mean, obviously, CLG came in with a different lineup when they played in the last chance qualifier. There's also a rule within the rulebook, by the way, that says that everything's at the discretion of the commissioner of the league. So also, if there was a really extenuating circumstance on one of these smaller things, they could make a different scenario. Now, one of the reasons why people were upset by eLeague removing Luminosity, I mean, if we're being fair, first and foremost, is because they're the best team in the world. And they have a lot of fans, and their fans are Brazilian. The Brazilian fans go nuts on Twitter. So that's one of the main reasons why people were upset. But beyond that, one of the main reasons is because there was actually a tweet made by the eLeague commissioner, Minsik Ko, formerly known as Rice, who said back when that whole dispute between SK and Luminosity was going on, where the SK, it was revealed that SK had signed these players' contracts, but the players said they weren't going to stay with SK, Goku SK rather, they were going to stay with Luminosity. When all that was going on the 31st of May, Minsik came out and he made a tweet that said, there are no plans to sanction either team. We look forward to having SK Gaming compete in Week 3 and Luminosity return for the playoffs. Now, it's obvious by the way he phrased that that's because at the time, the stated plan for both teams moving forwards was that SK would retain their Danish lineup, at least that's what they would have to do, because Luminosity was going to have their players, and the Brazilian players said that they'd stay at Luminosity and build something there and all the rest of it. So addressing that, in that world, obviously both teams were still eligible to compete. Luminosity still could compete at the time they were in Group A, so they were already in the playoffs. They would compete in the playoffs, and SK Gaming's Danish lineup still were part of the organisation. The other players hadn't joined until June 1st anyway. July 1st, that's when they were set to join, and so they could compete in week 3. Now, it is the case, obviously, that a problem here is that he doesn't address in his tweet what would happen if actually what the original story was ended up happening, which is that on July 1st, the Luminosity players went over to SK. Now, part of that is because the players themselves said that wasn't going to happen. Luminosity org said that wasn't going to happen. They were going to fight it in court, all this stuff. And on top of it, you can't really make a ruling until the thing happens. Because remember, some of it's at the discretion of the commissioner. Now, with that said, it was already in the rule book that if they were to do that, they would be ineligible to compete based on the rules in the rule book. So they could have looked in the rule book themselves, the orgs could have looked in the rule book, they didn't. Now, there was also the issue of other teams, when later on, it was thought by these teams that eLeague was going to maybe let the Luminosity guys go under the SK banner and compete in the last chance qualifying, continuing the tournament that way. These other teams, most notably North American orgs, apparently made a petition to tell eLeague that they didn't want this to be allowed to happen and that it shouldn't be allowed to happen. And that's something we'll get to later. But eLeague themselves came out with a report. Well, they didn't themselves come out with a report. There was a report about eLeague saying that apparently eLeague had already made the decision not to let the team compete in the last chance qualifier before this petition was made. So essentially it had no impact. But the knock-on effect, and why I have to reference it, is because that petition added into the fuel of people being angry about the best team in the world, Luminosity, not being in the tournament anymore, well, now SK Gaming, meant that people then also felt like this was bullshit, like it's unfair. I think a lot of people got confused and thought that actually this petition was stopping them competing in eLeague itself. I initially thought that until I read the finer details of it, and that it was somehow these orgs putting pressure on them that made eLeague make the decision to remove Luminosity and SK, which is not the case at all. It's already said, it was in their rules and they abided by their own rules, and that's why they removed them. So the biggest issue to start out with here is the issue of who the deal to be in this league was between. Was it between the players, the core 3 out of 5 players, as we have for majors, for example, who own the spot, or was it the org who owns the spot? Now, this is not even something that needs to be debated or questioned. It was explicitly between the orgs and not the players. It was essentially an organizations league, not a team league. And this can be seen, by the way, if you look at the way the league was put together, by the fact that orgs like Complexity, orgs like TSM, were involved from very early on in the process before the league even actually officially existed. And they were being talked to, and they were in a position where they got added to this league, despite the fact some of them had very bad lineups that do not deserve to be in a league like this, according to my personal opinion. Like, I think there's better teams out there from Europe, from Asia, who are better than these lineups. But they wanted to work with these orgs, notably big North American orgs with big histories in different games, Complexity in Counter-Strike, obviously TSM in League of Legends. And so these teams, as far as I can tell, Complexity and TSM, even put together their lineups specifically to compete in eLeague. Because before that, TSM didn't have a North American lineup, and then they bought a bunch of players' contracts up, and that's actually what caused them some of their problems initially in terms of getting better talent, because they didn't want to play with the people they already had contracted. Then Complexity lost some of their players to TSM, and then was in a position where they were scrambling to get players, and they ended up getting these UK players. You then look at some of the other teams in the league. So, okay, Echo Fox and NRG. These are other orgs which quite clearly are getting in because of the org in these two cases, because basketball players are involved in the ownership of this org. So that has great appeal to a company that's made inside the NBA as well. Whereas, you look at the players on these orgs, no, these orgs don't deserve to be in the league in as much as they haven't shown anything in other tournaments. And you go and you look at people like Immortals, I mean, they weren't Immortals at the time, like Tyloo. Admittedly, Tyloo didn't end up being able to compete in the league. Obviously, these people, and I mean, even some of the other lesser teams in Europe, are much better than these particular teams of players are now. But the orgs, no. Actually, these orgs have something to them. They have a merit if it's an organizational league. That's also, as far as I can tell, what some of the issue with Tempo Storm was as to why they weren't invited. Because their players clearly deserved a spot. They were clearly better than Echo Fox, for example. But, as far as we can tell, there was some sort of ownership clash. And if the deal is between the orgs and the league, and the league is trying to put together a model where they work with organizations, they want to vet those organizations, since these organizations are people they want to be in partnership with. And this is almost going towards a North American sports league approach, where for the NFL, for the NHL, for the MLB, for the NBA, the deal is between the league and the orgs. The players then come into it as part of the orgs. not as part of the league directly in that particular sense. And so that's, in those leagues, it's a closed system. It's a franchise model. Now, this is sort of like a franchise model, in as much as it's a deal between the org and the league, but it's not in as much as it's not exclusive. Obviously, these orgs can also go and compete in DreamHacks and ESLs and all the rest of it. So really, it's the American way of doing business when you get to the high level of leagues. This is not some new and unique thing that eLeague's come up with. This is actually the standard way of doing business in North American sports leagues. Now, the whole question of should it have been with the players is a very different one, because first of all, I don't even know what should means in that particular sense. If you're a television company making a television show which happens to be based around a computer game video league, I can understand why you'd want to make a deal between an org and not between a group of players, because you're trying to build a TV storyline, okay, of this team was in this, so Complexity was in the group stage here, and if they'd have won their group, they'd have been in the playoffs here, and you can follow Complexity's story the whole way through, not the players on Complexity. Because what happens if the players on Complexity had made the playoffs and then gone and signed with, let's say, for example, Mouse Sports, who were going to go into the last chance qualifier, and actually, in the end, let me think. Yeah, it did end up making it through to the playoffs anyway. But imagine that scenario where they go and sign with a different org. To the TV viewer, and to the TV company especially, this is a confusing storyline, because the players have now changed orgs. How are you going to address that on TV? I can understand why they don't want to do it in that particular way. It's actually one of the reasons, this is just as a side point of trivia, this is one of the things I think the West never picked up on of why Korean esports was so successful, is that in Korean esports, in both StarCraft and League of Legends, every season they had of the big OGN leagues, or NBC game when that existed, MSL, when they would have these leagues, they'd have an intro for the league. And what they'd do is they'd always present certain characters that you knew before. So yeah, there'd be the new up-and-coming stars, but if there was an old star still in the league, so League of Legends like Mad Life, who's not the best player anymore at his position, but it's still a legendary name, or in their case, like Nardus that used to get into OSLs quite late, despite the fact that he wasn't the best player anymore. The reason you keep putting those guys in the commercial is because remember, that's a TV channel that's doing that league, just like eLeague is. So don't think of it as just a league, and it's normal league from our world, where a league comes from having a 3-day LAN and you build up to it, then you have the LAN, then you go past it, and so you're building all your rules based on that. It's a TV series and you have certain narrative threads. And so what they were trying to do in these Korean StarCraft commercials is make it like a soap opera, so that the beginning of a soap opera, you see all the characters, hello Mrs. Benson, whatever. You get introduced to the newer characters, but you also see the classic characters that are always there all the time, and it unfolds the narrative for you where you remember that these are the storylines that are continuing through. So I can understand from eLeague's perspective why they would want to do the deals with the leagues. Also, add in, this is video game league. I even know at the professional level, if there weren't the same kind of contracts, there would be fuckery amongst the players leaving to go to elsewhere. So one of the ways they want to enforce a hierarchy is by doing the deal with the org, so then the org deals with their players. And as a result, you're also not in a scenario where, as I said, immaturity, players can just go and do whatever they want, and then they still have the league spot, and then they're holding the league and the orgs hostage. So this is quite interesting, because the Valve model cannot be compared to eLeague. Valve allows the players, 3 out of 5 core, as long as 3 out of the 5 stay together from the last major, they control the spot if they got on one of the legendary spots. Now, remember, Valve is not making a TV series. Valve is not trying to build certain narrative threads in the same way. Valve is trying to host world championships. They want to reward teams that finished in the legendary spots last time, and they want to essentially give away lots of money to the best players and make a spectacle for their game. So they're not in the business of necessarily making money off the name brands and franchising and building storylines that way. They're not a TV company. They're not making a TV show. That's the key point to understand. And also, in this particular scenario, Valve is getting the money from fans buying stuff, from supporting CSGO, and this is like a celebration. Each major is like a festival of Counter-Strike, giving money back to the pro players, making a huge spectacle for them, and we all celebrate the game of Counter-Strike and the best players in it. This isn't the case with a TV channel. A TV channel gets its own funding from sponsors and its own channel itself, then puts it in, and they're looking for their own returns and their own kind of viewership and their own metrics, and they know better than you or I, at least right now, how to run a TV channel like that. So whether we say, it should be 3 out of 5, okay, cool, we can see a certain fairness to that we think works better because we like the way it works in majors. But whether that would work for their system of how they're trying to create this channel, have narrative threads, and how they're going to build off it is another matter entirely. And since it is their league, eLeagues, and they put forwards the money, sure, you can critique it, you can have your own opinions, but I don't think it's unreasonable for them to have done it this particular way. There's also the fact that the Valve system does open you up to abuse, and this is something I'm going to get to. Now, first and foremost, remember, the rule here is that you can only make 2 roster moves. So as a result, SK Gaming making 5 roster moves is too much. That violates the rules. So according to the rules, it's absolutely legit that eLeague removed them. They didn't remove them over making up some rule themselves out of nowhere that never existed. This was a rule. It was in the rule book. The team violated the rules. Therefore, it's not that they were no longer allowed to compete. They were ineligible. They no longer met the eligibility guidelines and rules to compete in the league. They chose to do that. Now, what's interesting about the eLeague system is that the eLeague system, in one sense, is actually superior to the Valve system of 3 out of 5. And here's why. Because in the Valve system, okay, where the players control the spot, imagine this. Imagine, I'll pick a random team here. Imagine that, okay, I'll pick one now, okay. I'll say Gambit Gaming, because Gambit Gaming were surprised that they made the legendary status at this major, but they've got it now, and so for the next major, no matter what happens in the events leading up to then, Gambit Gaming is going to have a spot in the next major from a legendary status, one of the top 8 seeds, as a result of the previous performance. Now, here's what you don't realize about that spot. That opens the Gambit org up to abuse. Because remember, this is all hypothetical. Remember, the players are not going to do this. I'm using them as an example. Imagine that 2 weeks before the next major, the Gambit players come to their org and they say to the org, okay, so we've got a spot in the next major, but we've just been approached by a really big org and they're offering us 5 times the salary and even buyouts, and they're also offering us a signing bonus. And you know what? Fuck your contract. We're going to leave you and we're going to go and play for this new org in the major, unless you match their salary that they're offering, or you give us $100,000. Now, in that scenario, since there is no Valve court that you can go to and say, these people violate their contract, and real court would take a lot longer to pursue the case, it's very unlikely in a short amount of time you could get an injunction against this team competing. Essentially, Gambit, the org, is now held hostage by the players. They have to either pay the amount and get the players to stay with them, or the players can go, and then Gambit the org has to sit at home with no team playing in the competition, while those 3 out of 5, or even all 5, go and compete under the banner of this new org and play in Gambit's spot, essentially, in the major, and get to compete and do that. Despite the fact Gambit's paid all their salaries all the time, Gambit sent them to events, Gambit are the people who made it possible for them to get that last spot. None of that will matter because they can now hold the org hostage. Now, that can happen right now. Luckily, it doesn't happen, and it doesn't tend to happen. Although you can make the case, by the way, that essentially, in a way, it sort of happened to Luminosity, right? Luminosity, their team had a spot, and then they left and went to SK using the same spot that Luminosity had. Now, listen, Luminosity didn't earn that spot because the contracts ran out before the next major, so that's fine. But you can see one of the problems that could happen here, and how there's no way to stop that abuse in the Valve system. Now, let's go the other way. So the point to make is eLeague doesn't allow that, because remember, if you're the players, then you can only change 2 players. You still have to keep your core and stay in that org to compete in eLeague. If you leave the whole team, then you lose the spot. Therefore, you can't hold your org hostage. Likewise, though, what's good about the eLeague system is it goes the other way, because you might be worried in a league where the orgs own the spot and that's it, and there's no extra conditions of roster changes, then the org could hold the players hostage, right? So we'll give the Gambit example again. Let's imagine that the Valve rule was that the org owned the spot, but there was no roster, there was no 3 out of 5. So now imagine that we're in a world where 2 weeks before the next major, the org comes to their players and they say, listen, Hooch, Adren, Mo, guys, you're all out, because actually I've just been able to pull off a blockbuster signing, and I've actually been able to sign, in this case, we'll say a team that I think are better than Gambit overall. We'll say I've been able to sign the Immortals guys. And even though, you guys got me this spot here, I own the spot. And I'm going to bring those guys in wholesale. I think they're a better team than you, and they're going to play in your spot at the major. You can see how now the players can be held hostage by the org. The org can take the spot from them, or the org could even do the same thing. You know what? I've got those Immortals guys here, but I won't sign them if you guys agree to play for $1,000 less each per month. And the players, if they want to play in that major spot, probably have to agree, right? Again, there's org abuse could happen here. Now, that can't happen in eLeague either, because remember, even though the org owns the spot, they have no power of hostage over the players. The most they can do is change 2 players. They can't kick their whole team, like SK Gaming did, and say, you know what, you're out, guys. I've brought in a better team. They're going to play for me now in the playoffs, and you guys can fuck off, even though you guys earned the last chance qualifier spot. You know what? That's gone. I'm bringing in a better team, and they're playing for me. The org can't do that either. It's actually good that SK Gaming, the org, isn't allowed to just upgrade their team for the last chance qualifier. That's a positive. So in both directions, the eLeague rules actually stop abuse from players or orgs over who owns the spot and how they use it. Essentially, for the spots to mean anything, both groups of people have to cooperate. So for example, the players have to remain on the org that they started the league with, and the org has to remain with the core of the players that they started the league with as well. Nobody can go elsewhere or get an entirely new group of people, and so there can be no abuse on either side. Now, I will say, in light of these rules and the way it's done, I actually think that I wouldn't put this as a rule, because maybe eLeague themselves can't enforce this. They've just put the rules together themselves. But I would suggest that the players and the orgs themselves look into a new update to their own contracts, which is, if you're a smart org, next eLeague season, you will have your players contracted until at least the last day of eLeague. As a result, if they are contracted until the last day of eLeague, this can never happen to you. You can have the best team, you can have the worst team. You can never be in a situation where your whole players leave and you lose your spot, or or you're ineligible to compete. You can never be in a position where you sign a great team, but it's ineligible to compete. If you just make your contracts last till the end of eLeague, that can't happen. Now, Luminosity hadn't done that. Luminosity's contracts ended on the last day of June, I'm assuming, since the contracts began with SK from the 1st of July. Now, that means SK and Luminosity, if they'd looked up these rules, know that. Luminosity knows that unless I can get these guys to sign again, re-sign the contracts, I won't be eligible for the playoffs. Likewise, SK should know before they make the deal with the Brazilians that if I sign these guys from July 1st and the rules say this and they competed in week 1, then when I sign them, they won't be eligible to compete in the playoffs. Notice how you haven't seen anything from the SK Gaming Organization about this. SK Gaming Organization is very proactive when they think rules have been broken, things have been done unfairly. You haven't seen shit from them on their website about this. You haven't seen any explanation of how unfair this is, how it violates the rules, how they should have been allowed it. They just kept silent about it. I used to work at SK. They once had a scenario where Fnatic took a player that Fnatic said wasn't under contract, yet at the same time said, because he was under contract, you owe him salary. So SK came out, I was one of the journalists involved with this, we did an article about it, explained how unfair this is, about how it has to be one or the other, either he's under contract, in which case we owe him the salary, but he's still on our team, or he's not under contract, in which case you can take him, but we don't owe him the salary. We're very proactive on this. Numerous times I've seen them come out with statements about this stuff. In League of Legends, when Riot no longer allowed them to use their coach, they came out with comments about this, as far as I can remember, and petitioned that it should be the case. They've said nothing about this. Very interesting that it's only the players saying about this. So let's move forward with this. So, I mean, to give you another example, to just give you like another hypothetical, those rules also prevent an org continuing on in eLeague purely due to having enough money. So for example, Echo Fox got eliminated in last place, right? Imagine Echo Fox saw that Flipside got into the last chance qualifier, and Echo Fox buys Flipside's lineup and says, right, kick Flipside, org out, we get to compete in their spot in the playoffs, in the last chance qualifier. How would that be fair? Now, yes, under the 3 out of 5 Valve ruling, it would work, but it doesn't work in this particular sense. Also, another detail to add to wrap up the whole Valve 3 out of 5 thing is, Valve 3 out of 5 is between tournaments, guys. If you compete in one major and you keep 3 of those players, you can compete in the next major as players under any org. Now, that doesn't work in the fucking actual tournament itself. It's not like someone goes in the group stage and then changes org between the group stage and the playoff quarterfinals and then continues on. In the group stage, they were Gambit and now suddenly they're Echo Fox in the quarterfinals. That doesn't exist. Yet eLeague is essentially one tournament drawn out over like 2 or 3 months, right? So why would you be able to change from the group stage to a completely different org for the playoffs of the same tournament? Remember, this isn't majors is between one major and another. That's 2 tournaments. eLeague Season 1 is one tournament. You're trying to change between the tournament. That's the problem, because the deal in the one tournament is between your org and the league, not between the org and the players. Now then, first of all, I will add one other detail in terms of the aspect of why these teams couldn't just compete. So for example, why couldn't Luminosity's players just sign a temporary contract and go back to Luminosity and play under Luminosity in the playoffs? Why couldn't the SK Gaming players, the Danish guys, just sign a temporary contract and compete under SK in the last chance qualifier? That's a question that I have to leave out there. I can't say anything about it. I would say, ask those orgs why. Ask Luminosity's org why that can't happen. Ask SK's org why that can't happen. As an independent observer, I would say, look at it this way. What would it benefit the SK guy who's had all this legal threats from a Luminosity org? He's had all this bad blood, players saying he's unethical, he's a liar, he's dishonest, the org saying he's turned his players against the Luminosity org. Now that he's finally got those players under his possession with his jersey on, competing for him, winning a major, why would he let them go back to Luminosity? If the only option is you can go and compete under Luminosity and they'll win the eLeague, best team in the world, remember, as Luminosity, even though they're your players now, why would you let that happen? The only option for you that you're willing to entertain, right, would be if they could compete in your last chance qualifier spot. You know that can't happen now because the roster move means they can't. Likewise, let's go the other way. Why would the Luminosity guy, in his world, let the players, let's say there was some option to even have them go to SK, which there isn't, and compete under SK for the rest of eLeague. If he can fuck with them and say, well, I own the spot, why would he allow that to happen? Well, he doesn't win there. So no one wins in these scenarios. Yeah, it helps the fans, but none of these orgs win. And that's why I think you notice both orgs, who were very vocal about other things and bringing forward information to journalists and putting out comments, neither said jack shit about this move. Luminosity hasn't said anything. Nobody's said anything. That's suspicious, right? So if you want to know those answers, go ask those guys, because they're conveniently quiet about these particular issues. Now then, the players of Luminosity, now SK Gaming, came out and they were making all these comments. First of all, they said that they only found out on Twitter and they never were contacted directly about this move of them being disqualified. Right? First things first, why would the players be contacted about this? It is a league that is a deal between the league and the org, not the players. The players are to be contacted by the org. So what happens is, eLeague contacts SK Gaming org and tells them, you're not eligible to play. It's then SK Gaming, the org's responsibility, to tell the players of SK Gaming why they can't compete and that they can't compete. It's not the eligible. Why would eLeague have to go out to, let's think how many teams, wasn't there like 25 teams in eLeague? What? So it's up to eLeague to go and contact every member of all these teams personally and say this, rather than say it to the company that employs them as players in their league. And the people that eLeague actually has the agreement between, by the way, not between the players, it's between the teams, the orgs, and the league itself. So that claim itself is bogus, by the way. They were never obliged to do that. Also, there's another area to ask SK Gaming about, right? Why did SK Gaming, the organization, not come out with the same claim? Why didn't they put out an article saying this is very unprofessional? eLeague didn't contact us telling us that our players couldn't compete. They just announced it on Twitter. We found out on Twitter. They never said that. They've never said anything about this. They've never said that we weren't contacted. So that means, logically, I would put forward the speculation that SK Gaming, the org, did know and either didn't tell their players or allowed their players to go out and make this ruckus to make some bad blood and didn't ever correct them. Now, as a side point, I've brought this up before when I've talked about Fallen and the rest of it. There's a really bad habit of these Brazilian players. I don't know if it's just their culture and that the way they interact with Twitter, because I've noticed a lot of people from different countries, etc., come off very differently on Twitter than they do in real life. Like, they don't seem to understand how they're being perceived or how they're saying something in a very blunt manner. So actually, I know, for example, I've actually learned that some German people were coming off on Twitter as very douchey and obnoxious because from talking to them and asking them about what they meant, since their first language is German, this is just a speculation on my part and talking to these people, it seems to me as though German is a fairly blunt language. And you come out and you say what you mean and you say it in a very simplistic manner, you say this. But English has a lot of nuance to it, and people are reading a lot into the nuance of what you're saying and specific words you're saying. So if you say something in a very blunt manner, people will think you're just an asshole. You haven't softened that at all. The etiquette's totally off. So I actually think some of these German people I'm talking about have seemed like they were super douchey, but actually they were just trying to make a point. Like, no, that's the way that is. They didn't mean that like with the implication of like, and you can suck it, and you better just put up with it, mister, and I'm not even going to discuss it. All these things that in English you might take those implications if someone said it that way. They actually just meant, no, that's actually just the way it is in the way that we're doing it at the moment. Like, they didn't mean it. So I wonder if, for whatever reason, Portuguese, Brazilian culture, if there's something within that where they seem very exuberant, etc. in person, and that's not being transmitted online, and they're just coming off, unfortunately, very hysterical. And so a lot of these tweets, like these ones we're talking about, they're not logical. They're coming across like they're hysterical, like they're just lashing out at people everywhere. This is unfair, this is bullshit, even though these are all the rules, this is all the way the league was stated from day one, this is all the way it was initially. Apparently their own orgs didn't describe to them what the relationship with the nature of the league and the orgs were. They allowed the players to think that the players ran the spots. Never the case from day one. Nothing was changed. Nothing was made unfair for you particularly. Yet these players are not only tweeting hysterically, but essentially rabble-rousing, trying to rise teams up and players up against the leagues and their own orgs and against everyone. This isn't productive for anyone, guys. I understand people are upset. And by the way, I'm sure I've made tweets before, which even if I thought themselves they were justified, as I'm sure these players did, they had that effect of rabble-rousing or being too hysterical and other people catching on to that and using that as a way to go ham at people. Sure, that happens. Problem is, this is happening again and again and again. Like, for example, Fallen had a tweet, okay, where he said, 6th of July, so a day after the move, first time in Counter-Strike, players are being punished for getting better and evolving professional-wise out of eLeague due to change org. Again, that was in the rules, so that's irrelevant. Now, the idea that they're being punished for getting better and evolving professional-wise, very interesting that Fallen would say this, because remember, he's the guy who was saying about how SK had lied to them and about how they turned the people against the org and about how Alex had, the new owner of his new owner at SK, had tricked all his teammates into thinking it was a good deal. Yet suddenly he's now describing moving to SK as they're being punished for getting better and evolving professional-wise because he's got a better contract now and a better deal and all the rest of it. Now he's representing a bigger org. Funny how that works, isn't it? Then he adds in this comment here, which is really my big problem with this whole issue. One day we will have players fighting for our rights. A players' union shall in reality exist. Players lost a lot today. Nah, actually, orgs lost a lot today. 2 orgs no longer have teams competing due to the way this scenario went down. Now, in terms of Luminosity, they lost the best team in the world because the way the rules were, they've just lost their team. Okay, they only have the spot because if those players stay, they've lost their spot in eLeague. I mean, admittedly, it's not really their spot. I'll point that out because their spot ends on July 1st when they no longer have that team contracted. SK, the org, has lost a team. Now, they chose to lose a team and kicked out a team. They could have still had the Danish people compete. So, again, I don't feel sorry for the org there. Now, in terms of the players, who's lost a lot? Not the Luminosity players. Because remember, as Fallen said, he's trying to get better and evolving professional-wise, as in get a better contract, go to a bigger org. So he's chosen not to compete in eLeague by not re-signing with Luminosity, the only organization he was allowed to compete with as this 5-man unit in eLeague. So he's chosen not to compete in eLeague, and he's now, apparently didn't know that, and is now complaining about it because he's gotten a better deal elsewhere in terms of money and his salary. The people who've actually been fucked over here are the ex-SK guys, right? That's the problem. They're the people I feel sorry for because SK's kicked them out, so they're gone. But by the way, SK's prerogative to do that. But essentially, why is SK kicked them out? Because they could get the Luminosity players. So actually, in a sense, bearing in mind Fallen and his team signing those contracts is a big part of how this whole mess was able to happen and was activated and these rules were broken. Essentially, you could make a case that indirectly, unknowingly, Fallen and his players are the ones that have punished the ex-SK players by taking away their spot to compete in the last chance qualifier. They've done that. If they hadn't assigned these contracts and gone over, that couldn't happen. Now, that's not entirely the case. They're not entirely to blame. They've just done what they can for their career. And also, their contracts were ending anyway, and they could have gone elsewhere anyhow. But by making this big mess about it, you're talking about players getting screwed over. Yeah, you're part of that, mate. Your actions have taken part in screwing over those SK guys who had no say in it. They had no say in whether Luminosity players joined. They had no say in SK dropping them and no longer having them represent them. They're the ones who lost their spot through no actions of their own. Luminosity players lost it directly through actions of their own, just they didn't understand the consequences. I also have a big issue with this because I think player rights is a very important issue. And you'll notice in most cases, I come down on the side of players versus orgs and leagues because I know players are the least represented. I know players are the least informed. I know players have the least rights. But I don't go the other way. I don't make it like players should have all the rights and all the power and all the say, and fuck orgs, who, by the way, pay for those players and give them salaries and allow them to fly to events. Fuck leagues, who allow those players to play for orgs and play for huge prize money and get the sponsors in that give them the money that they're able to compete for and win and a platform to be great players. I don't say strip all the rights away from them and just give them to these fucking young players who don't know what they're doing and let those guys be like fucking Joffrey the King, just mad guys out of control, immature, just making ridiculous rules and comments here and there and just ruining everything. No, I don't go the other way and say they should have no rules. I think there's a disproportionate amount of rights on the side of orgs and leagues, certainly, but I don't think that means it should all go to the players, which is the way players, because they want their power themselves, are themselves representing things. I mean, there's a great quote from Albert Camus, one of my favorite philosophers, where he says something along the lines of, every slave starts wanting justice and ends wanting a crown. The point is, initially, you fight for your rights because you want it to be fair. But then once you get to that point, you go, I could keep fighting here, maybe get more rights. I could keep fighting and get things more. The same way, all the way around, the org was fucking you and taking all the rights away from you. So now you want to be the king. You want to decide everything. You want to run everything. And that's my problem with this, is that whole issue is probably something I'll make another video on one day. Believe it or not, probably in some minor level, defending orgs and leagues. But on this particular issue, the reason why I don't like that being brought up at this moment is because this was never about player rights. This was about a league that was set up in a certain way, some players making a choice that made them ineligible to play in the league anymore, ignoring those rules that had existed since day one. Imagine if eLeague just violated their own rules and everyone else was fucked over who might have done things like that and gotten a better player or gotten a better team, and they couldn't do it, but suddenly Luminosity, now SK, is allowed to do it. How would that be fair? But in this world where Fallen's making it seem like that, a player rights issue, he's conflating two issues that don't belong with each other in this particular case. Player rights is a very important issue, but it's a separate issue entirely. So remember that. Luminosity's players, now SK Gaming, are the ones who literally enabled this scenario and fucked the ex-SK guys out of their last chance qualifier spot. Fallen bring up player rights, which is a different topic, and as a result muddying the issue, because obviously many of us are in favour of player rights and more player rights. Just that it doesn't apply to this particular league right now. And the way it was negotiated, and nobody was mistreated or had anything unfair done to them as a result of eLeague and their rules that were set up. Nothing was changed. There was no abuse of players in this particular scenario. This is what the agreement was from day one. If Luminosity's players didn't like it, then why did them and their org compete in eLeague? As in, they didn't have to. It wasn't compulsory. They could have gone and competed in the entire open circuit where it is the 3 out of 5 rule, and when you can do all that stuff and you can compete for any org and you can move anywhere. They chose to enter a league in which the org owns the spot, and they did so, and now they're complaining that they don't want that to be the rule anymore. Okay, you can ask for the rule to be changed. You can say you think the rule should be changed, but you did enter that agreement, and now you're the one balking at that and pretending like the agreement never existed, and this is just unfair mistreatment. And the reason why I dislike this is because by bringing up a totally separate issue, and one in which players are the ones in the right, whereas in this scenario, you're in the wrong, I feel like he's tried to muddy the issue. I don't know whether he's done it consciously to drive public sentiment against eLeague by making it like, oh, well, are you on the side of players' rights? Well, of course I am. Then you must be against eLeague who've done this. No, that doesn't work. It actually reminds me of the recent documentary O.J. Simpson made in America. Because one of the disgusting things about this documentary, I always wondered, how did he get off with that case? At the time, as a young person who heard about it, I didn't know much about the case. I assumed, right, must have had some super sick lawyer. Maybe the lawyer built this like genius case. Okay, those are all true to a degree, but one of the main ways he got away with the case, put it this way, okay, I remember hearing that he got off with the murder, which it seemed very likely he'd done, and I remember seeing this name, Johnny Cochran, his lawyer, and I thought to myself, because I didn't know much about American culture, I don't know anything about legal cases, oh, Johnny Cochran must be like a famous fixer. He must be the guy you call in when you know you're guilty, you know you're in big trouble, you pay him shit tons of money, and he comes up with the most genius sort of like weird, abstract reason as to why you didn't commit the murder. And that's what we all thought we heard, because we all thought it was about that if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. We all thought it was some sort of mental hypnosis trick on the jury. Turns out it wasn't. If you watch this whole documentary, it's like 7.5 hours long, the different 5 parts. Then what you'll find out is the only reason Johnny Cochran's there is because Johnny Cochran took part in cases that were civil rights cases, where it was nearly always a black person against like the police or the government, and it was nearly always that, sure, the black person might have done some crime, but they were like, it was way over the top, the treatment that they'd had, and they'd clearly been mistreated, and most likely on racial grounds. That's who he represented. So actually hiring him signaled that OJ was being mistreated, and it was racism against him by the police who were arresting him for this murder that he was alleged to have committed. So in this scenario, that's the way the whole case was built. That's the whole battleground they fought the case on. And they really made the case about, don't we all think racism against black people is terrible by police who probably do have some racist element in at that point in time. And so since most people and the public sentiment is, of course, we understand there's abuse and all the rest of it, they really got mind-fucked into thinking that means he's not guilty. That was never anything to do with whether that person committed those murders. It was irrelevant to whether in general society there is racism and there is discrimination against certain people of color by the police and in this particular scenario, and they've been harsh. That was not an issue. And so by conflating those two issues and then making it all about one of them that you already have people on your side with, that's part of how they were able to create the conditions which meant that he went free on that particular case. So I actually think that that's why this is not a relevant issue, the player rights issue, and I don't like that it was brought up. Now, in terms of the teams petitioning to not let the Luminosity, now SK Gaming players compete under SK Gaming in the last chance qualifier. First of all, it's irrelevant because eLeague, I mean, as I've said, the news came out that they'd already decided not to let it happen anyway. And so this petition doesn't matter. Secondly, it also doesn't matter in as much as it never would have abided by the rules anyway. So actually, eLeague would have been in big trouble if they'd have allowed the team to compete under SK in the last chance qualifier. In fact, people like me should at that point have been coming out with videos if that had happened, saying this violates your own rules. And it doesn't matter that one clause says the commissioner of rules, or you put your rules in here, and if that had been the case, then you've screwed all the other teams in the league. Because, for example, what if this other team here had gone out in the group stage, but they had the money to upgrade, and they could have done the same as SK, and they could be in the last chance qualifier. You didn't allow them to because you set the rules that you've now discarded. So we should have been doing that in that scenario. So actually it's irrelevant, the whole petitioning thing. It's actually fair in terms of the rules what happened, which is that they shouldn't be allowed to compete. So actually even the sentiment of these teams isn't wrong. Now I myself did kind of a hot take tweet where I can stand by my tweet because I said if these teams purely petitioned on the basis they were scared to play the SK Gaming players, yeah, that is cowardice if that's your real motivating factor. Now then, if your motivating factor is the rules of the league say you can't do this, so you're not going to allow it, then it's absolutely fair for these teams to petition in that sense. And it was the orgs, not the players, who did the petitioning. So it's irrelevant what the players say. Oh, I never agreed to that. It doesn't matter, mate. Remember, the agreement was never between the players and the league. It was between the orgs and the league. Now then, another issue to make out. Because this was nothing to do with players at any level, in terms of who decided any of this, it doesn't matter that these players came out and said that. I also think, in terms to tie it into the players' right thing again, this is why I think it's dirty that Fallen came out and the other players came out. This is bullshit. We stand with Luminosity's players. We don't agree with this. They should be in eLeague. The reason why that's dirty to me is because these players, again, talked about players' rights and this is the way it's going to be. Yet these players, that's all idle talk. Talk means fuck all unless you're going to back it up with actions. Likely, none of the players you're thinking of from massive teams will leave their org at the end of their contract, make their own organization, work for players' rights, or go to a new org and demand in the contract that extra special players' rights are there. They won't do any of that shit. They'll continue to work for some of the biggest orgs in the whole business that give some of the least player rights. They'll continue to work for bigger salaries for those orgs. They will continue to re-sign with those orgs. They won't do any of that shit. And by the way, you want to know my prediction? So will Fallen and SK. They won't be going to some separate thing and working on players' rights themselves either. That's my prediction, at least at the moment. So that's all idle talk, which again, as much as it might sound good, unfortunately in this case, seems to serve the aim of rabble-rousing and turning people against eLeague in this particular sense. So the key point to understand, fucking hell, is that this is a different kind of league that we've ever seen before. If it was up to me and these leagues rules didn't exist, and you said, would you like to see SK Gaming play in the playoffs? Well, obviously I would, because I'm a fan of the best Counter-Strike. So in my world, I want to see the best teams play. Now, this isn't about that, though. It's not about Thorin saying, yeah, but I want to see the best teams play. It's about what teams are eligible to play. In fact, that's the best thing about this ruling, is that this league had the balls to kick out the number one team in the world, the reigning world champions, because they violated the rules in terms of the org didn't have a team to field, and the new org they went to couldn't field a team because they weren't eligible, even though they were the best team in the world. Because you're supposed to, with rules, ignore the quality of the team. You don't give one set of rules for the best teams and one set of rules for the lesser teams. You ignore the team and you just go by the rules. And so this was a consistent ruling, actually. Whether you agree with the rules and how they should be done, this was consistent with the rules. The ex-SK Gaming players, as I said, the ones I feel most sorry for, because I know that they had no say in any of this, and that even, some of it was even taken on their behalf, essentially, by the ex-Luminosity guys coming over to their org and displacing them. Last point to make, teams, if they want to compete in a league like eLeague or any other franchise league, need to adapt to the new rule system, and I would suggest always contract your players until the end of that league. Make mini temporary contracts just for that league if you want to. Whatever you have to do, don't let this scenario happen again, because it is on you, the orgs, and the players as well, to make sure this doesn't happen again. It's not on eLeague as long as these rules are the way they are.